Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Diaspora History Podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Welcome to Diaspora History Podcast. I am your host, Wendy, Aris. And in this conversation, I am truly honored to have joined today Gabrielle Garrard of the podcast Caribbean Mystics, which is a powerful platform dedicated to exploring Caribbean history, spirituality, culture, and lived experience, especially as it relates to the Virgin Islands. Gabrielle's work invites us to think deeply about what it means to be Caribbean while living under U.S. territorial rule, and how that political status has shaped identity, cultural movement, and belonging in the Virgin Islands. Through storytelling, education, and community dialogue, Caribbean Mystics create space for conversations that are often overlooked but deeply felt by those living the reality. This episode is a wonderful collaboration where we'll be talking about all things Virgin Island, from history and cultural memory to the lasting impacts of being a U.S. territory, and what that means for self-determination, representation, and Caribbean connection today. I'm excited to share this conversation with you, and I'm grateful for Gabrielle for bringing her insights, care, and knowledge to the table. So let's have a listen. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Gabrielle Garrard, for coming on to the podcast, Diaspora History, and to speak about your island nation and, of course, why you became such an advocate, so to speak, of it. But before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. I would like to preemptively say that I do live in the Virgin Islands, and so you might be hearing a chicken in my background. So you guys are getting the authentic Caribbean experience. I am a multi-generational Virgin Islander. I'm a multi-generational Virgin Islander. My family can be traced back to the Virgin Islands as far back as like the early 1800s, maybe late 1700s. And I am also a content creator. And as somebody that grew up in the Virgin Islands and has such a robust history within the Virgin Islands, I grew up around a lot of storytelling.
Mhm.
And so my father would spend a lot of time taking us outside in the garden and planting and, digging banana hole. And he would use that opportunity to tell stories. And I really fell in love with the storytelling of it all, but also the historical component and understanding why people do the things they do and how a lot of decisions ripple outward, across time and space and bloodlines and generations, because they kind of help to inform where we are right now in the Virgin Islands politically, as well as give context of the future we might be crafting without course correction. And then as I got older, I really fell in love with the concept of TikTok and the fact that you could anonymously, like talk to strangers from around the world. And I just started talking about Caribbean history and lore and legend, and people were really interested. And then I quickly realized that TikTok is, in fact, not anonymous. And the For You page will toss you on to the For You pages of fellow Virgin Islandos. And people locally really appreciated what I was doing. But I also recognized that there was a need for me to get really specific in my content and focus on Virgin Islanders and Virgin Islands history. And so that's what I did. And I continued on to Instagram and Facebook. And then I'm also a very big lover of spirituality and spiritual tradition. And I also started a paranormal podcast that features true supernatural stories out of the Caribbean called Caribbean Mystics. And it's been pretty successful. And we collect paranormal stories from all across the Caribbean that are true, and we showcase them on the show. It is the only paranormal podcast out to the Caribbean. And I find that work to be deeply illuminating and inspiring because it centers the storytelling, but there's also a cultural backdrop because I find Caribbean spirituality to be deeply misunderstood, both in the region and then in a global setting. And so, for instance, the way that like spiritual traditions like Santeria and voodoo have been demonized through the purview of Christianity, I think has been very painful, and it has been to the detriment of our region as it relates to our connection to identity. And so it is tremendous honor to be able to center those stories, but to also bring an educational component and an invitation for people to start to deconstruct
Mhm.
their limitations that they've put on African belief systems and Caribbean belief systems and encourage them to open the box on what God could look like.
No, thank you so much for all of that. And, we'll start, and I think you did touch upon in terms of what was the spark that led you to become such an advocate for the Virgin Islands?
Yeah, I love my people and I love my islands and I love my culture. And I think that I get up every day and I see the way in which my community continues to change. And
Mhm.
I see a lot of my people having to leave the Virgin Islands because they can't afford it here or because there is what feels like an invisible glass ceiling. If you don't already come with wealth, if you don't already come with status and resources behind you, there's a way in which you're tucked under the table. And one of the things that make me very filled with grief is the fact that we had spaces that were predominantly Virgin Island spaces or mixed spaces now becoming predominantly white. And we have whole neighborhoods that are being gated off and schools that predominantly host, you know, white children this and transplant children despite the fact that we live in a predominantly Black community, and the fact that that's a statistical enigma to have a school that's 90% plus white in a on an island that's predominantly Black. And so those things really give me a lot of grief because there's a way in which the damage has been done. And there are some families that have moved away that will probably never move back. And the further they get down their generational line, the less connected they'll be with their Caribbean heritage, while having people who are wealthy and highfalutin come into our islands and want to change everything about it without any regard. There's a callous disregard for the people that already live here and for the culture, and even for the ecological practices of the land.
And not only that, at this time, there's so much migration that is happening from the West to other places. And you're right, it will displace the people that have been living in those spaces
Yeah.
significantly. Now, you said, in your introduction, in terms of, when you were growing up and you remember in terms of when you were doing things with your father, that was were the times in terms of the stories being told to you. Do you feel that that kind of helped and shaped this path for you?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the more on the more pragmatic side, I saw firsthand how storytelling could really shape your belief system, and it when told right could be quite evocative, and it really made me feel something. And I think that that is on a very like human level, the way in which you capture people, you capture their hearts. And so the way that I love to use storytelling is to capture hearts, but also to remind Caribbean people what we're fighting for.
Mhm.
There's a way in which we get lost in the textbook history of the Caribbean, and sometimes we don't always remember and we don't always practice the practices that I think make us who we are on a value level, like the notion of like burying your child's umbilical cord into the ground so their soul can be tied to the land and ancestry, into heritage, I think is really powerful, and it's something that we're losing. The concept of bush baths, and when a baby is brought into the world, the mother getting a bush bath and helping
Mhm.
to close the bones and,
Mhm.
protect the womb, or and that on a physical level, but also the spirituality of it. Giving a baby a bush bath as a way of christening and using herbs from the earth and the ground. Again, there's that soil element, that ancestral element, that communion with the spirits of the human world and the spirits of the land coming together. And so I just feel like there's a way in which the textbook knowledge of, like, political history and United States hegemony don't always bend to the whim of spiritual wisdom and knowledge. And that's what I found most compelling about the storytelling, is there's a mystical element in every regard. Even when you look at it through a pragmatic approach with, like, political history, there's also a way in which you see destiny threads being woven throughout time, and you really start to understand on a really foundational level about how, like, everything we do, every step we make, the partners we pick, the friends we have, even the people that move here, how it continues to shift everything and the future.
No, it's definitely a connection, and I just feel that especially with being in nature and connecting to the earth, it does ground you on a
Yeah.
level, and it does bring you. I know for myself, when I went to Jamaica last year and being up, as you can see in my, back screen, being up in the mountains, it was definitely very, you know, I would say very balancing, so to speak,
Mhm.
and very calming to just to be in that element, to be in that space, and just to enjoy what was all around me and not be trapped in, of course, into the concrete jungle, so to speak, and being
Yeah.
disconnected. There was a connectedness, if anything. And
Mhm.
I guess, that leads me to, I guess, again, the stories. What do you feel, we're missing or misunderstood in a lot of these stories?
I would say that when I look at for instance, when I look at a lot of the tourism product and the storytelling that we have leaned largely on over the last 50 years or so, I find it to be deeply whitewashed and deeply amending itself to, like, Christian values, or almost skirting around, like, African belief systems
Mhm.
that have shaped the region. So, like, a really great example of that is the way that carnival is marketed.
Mhm.
We don't always acknowledge how much ritual and ceremony is really imbibed in the carnival experience. And in fact, I would say before it is a tourism product, before it is a thing for people to do to go to work, before it's anything, it is a spiritual practice across the board. Like, when you're looking at Juve, when you're looking at a beating of the drums, like the village, like that people go to and come together in, there is so much spiritual depth that is a part of those experiences, the Mokojumbi. And there's a way where we have separated the spirit from it and we've commodified it because we're trying to attract people to come and to spending money and to enjoy. And I think that there's a way where we have desecrated some of the practice. Even when you look at the parades that are happening, you see that there is an erosion of a lot of those traditional parade figures that you used to see 20, 30, 40 years ago. And each figure had its own storyline attached to it, and it was a remembrance. And particular like there's a particular rebellion and resistance spirit that comes from remembrance. And I think that that continues to be eroded the more we continue to separate ourselves from the spirit that's connected to so much of what we do here. And a lot of those practices that we've been commodifying for the enjoyment of outsiders has divested itself from the true depth of the experience.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned about spirit because that is a major component of all of that. And for you, Gabrielle, what do you feel that people get wrong about the Virgin Islands history?
I mean, if I want to be like super annoying, because I feel like there's a contingent of people that like get really annoyed, but like I feel I really detest, specifically in the Virgin Islands, how we adopted the America's Paradise branding. And I feel like for whatever reason, and I think that it's complex,
Mhm.
there's a way where people don't always include the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean as like a Caribbean island because we are under United States hegemony. And I find it to be a reflection of the way that empire continues to dispossess Caribbean people from their Caribbean heritage.
Mhm.
And a lot of statesiders come to the Virgin Islands and they see the Virgin Islands as an appendage of the United States. And so they get frustrated when they don't see, the Starbucks or the mail takes longer or how come the roads are so, skinny. And it's all of these like frivolous complaints. And I don't think a lot of people understand that Virgin Islanders are Caribbean people first. And we are connected to the United States as a byproduct of colonialism. But it was not the will of our people. We've never been given a chance to self determine. We've been passed from one colonial power to the next. And at the end of the day, when you look at this whole situation happening in the United States with Greenland, the reason why Greenland belongs to Denmark in large regard is because of the Lansing Treaty,
Mhm.
which identified that the United States would go with the Virgin Islands and they would abdicate, I guess, their desires for Greenland. And so when you see somebody like Trump talking about taking Greenland, that essentially severs the treaty. And so you leave us in the balance of trying to figure out, so what does that mean? We go back to Denmark. And the very act of having to ask, identifies just how deeply we need our own sovereignty. And people get frustrated when I say that because they're like, oh, the Virgin Islands can't survive as an independent Caribbean nation, and they like to be like, oh, look at the other Caribbean islands. And, there's so much corruption and whatever. And what happens when a storm passes and we have to figure it out? And I also find that to be a byproduct of the colonial machine. It is the notion that we don't have it within ourselves. We don't have the integrity. We don't have the leadership. We don't have the grit to figure it out, the intellect, the knowledge, the skill set to figure it out. And I think that is to our detriment. But also, us self-determining is not a absolute, we go to independence. And that's never what I advocate for. But I think that we should get a right to choose what that looks like, whether it's statehood or even developing a constitution. The Virgin Islands has tried to develop a constitution for decades,
Mhm.
and our constitutional conventions continue to fail for a few different reasons, including the fact that we keep trying to figure out what identity looks like, or the fact that Congress has to approve whatever we say, like that we want as a people, which is another way that we don't actually have autonomy and sovereignty. And so Congress shoots it down if we try to identify what a native Virgin Islander is and they find it to be unconstitutional for white Americans in the States and their ability to own land and to benefit from Virgin Islands infrastructure.
No, definitely, and that's, I guess, with a lot of the territories within the United States. This is
Yeah.
the same question that keeps coming up in terms of their own identity and, of course, their own autonomy as well. And I know that we were talking before the recording, Gabrielle, of why does it matter who tells the story?
It matters who tells the story for a lot of reasons. First and
Mm.
foremost, if we're going to commodify our stories, the people who have shaped those stories, kept those stories alive, and continue to embody those stories should be the ones that benefit first, primarily. But also, when you have other people telling our stories, they will misrepresent our storytelling because they simply don't understand it. And there's a way where when you're not a part of it, you can't possibly understand the depth
Mhm.
of those stories. And so a really good example of that is sometimes people come to me and they'll ask me, Gabby, how come you don't tell Anansi stories on your page?
Mhm.
I am not a Black Virgin Islander. And I feel like I would like to see a Virgin Islander or a Caribbean person in general be able to tell those Anansi stories because they're so sacred and they're so rooted in West African tradition. And I don't get to benefit from that, despite the fact that my family been here for hundreds of years, right? And I think that there's a way where being a Virgin Islander and being in this region and understanding how I, as a phenotypically white person, gets to move through this community in certain ways that may be more difficult or tedious for somebody else of another background, or even my ability to go to the States or Europe and not have to experience a lot of the invisible ceilings and barriers that my Black brothers and sisters have to experience. I think that there's a way where, that's just a byproduct of growing up here and understanding that identity and belonging is deeply complex. And so I say that to say that there are people that do not understand that level of love and care and integrity that it requires to exist in a community that's deeply multifaceted. So I'll have people come to the Virgin Islands, and after 25 years, they're talking about, oh, and I want to bury my daughter's umbilical cord on the island because this island just feels like home. And it's just like, well, that's not your cultural practice. This isn't your land, and you're a guest in somebody else's home. No matter how long you've been here, you can feel very much like this is your home and this and the other. And I honor that. And I think everybody deserves to have a safe space, and they deserve to have a community that fills them up. But there is a Western fixation on possession where you see a beautiful thing and you feel like you have to possess it. I need my slice of paradise because I just love that island. I need to observe a bit of that culture. Like, I get irritated when I see people as Mokojumbis that are not Caribbean, and maybe that's me gatekeeping, maybe I'm toxic, maybe in 5 years, after more reading and research and discussion, my views on it will change. But I think it's okay for there to be certain practices that certain people don't participate in, while also being the people that uplift those practices. So I think I think people telling our stories, I think who tells the story is important because there has to be a lived experience attached to it.
No, I definitely agree with that, because there has to be not only a lived experience, but to know and understand the context from which because they're looking from their lens, from their own lived experience, which has
Yeah,
nothing to do with the Caribbean itself. So if
absolutely.
they're gonna tell something very, very different from what actually really truly should be told. You know what I mean? So,
Absolutely.
and then, leading into then, of course, then what happens when these stories aren't even preserved?
I think we lose a lot, The something that a lot of people don't realize, for instance, is that the Virgin Islands had its own language at one point,
Mm,
and it was a mixture of, a Creole, Danish, Caribbean-esque the language. It was a language.
mhm,
And because of, the American purchase and this need to like teach English in schools, and the demonizing of the language being, something that is primitive or you're uneducated or what. It's the same thing we do with our accents.
yes,
Right? It's
yes.
just like if you don't talk in a standard English accent, you're somehow, like a misinformed, uneducated, not well read, not well traveled individual. And so that's also why I'm very committed to speaking in my accent, regardless of who I'm talking to or what the situation is, because I think that the only way we reframe these misinformations and misconceptions, and the only way we heal the wounding within ourselves that somehow we are not enough as Caribbean people and we have to somehow reshape ourselves and be malleable to fit in. I don't want to participate, to be honest. And
Mhm,
so yeah, I think that that is an example that I think is actually filled with grief, that we lost an entire language that was deeply unique to the Virgin Islands due to United States influence. And so I think that what it does is it removes a lot of the richness of our stories and the wealth of our stories. And in 50 years, if we don't even talk about the language, then we may have children that may never even know that. And over time, it becomes easier for the gentrification and the settler colonialism and the displacement and dispossession to happen because over time, as a people, we forget what we're fighting for.
Exactly. Exactly. We lose a piece of ourselves, whether we realize it or not. And then that leads me into, I guess, with how can, of course, the diaspora communities stay connected?
Yeah, I would say, you know, that's a complex topic. And every couple of months on Virgin Islands, Facebook will have these long, sprawling arguments because when people have to leave their Caribbean community because they cannot afford it or there's not the medical infrastructure, the educational infrastructure to support them, or maybe there's a lot of trauma and they, for their own sense of like mental health and safety, have to leave because the trauma is so deep and so acute they have to do that. I think that there's a particular grief that a lot of people observe when they have to leave their home. And there is a really hard acknowledgement that you have to confront that I love my home and my home does not always feel like it loves me back. And it does not create a space in which me and my family or me and my dream or me and my business can thrive. And so I think that there's a lot of complex feelings. And as somebody that's chosen to stay in the Virgin Islands, despite the hardship, and also having the privilege of being able to do so because I don't have a medical condition that renders me needing to leave or anything like that, I honor that. And I also honor the fact that as a Virgin Islander, it's very frustrating when Virgin Islanders leave and they remind us of all the reasons they leave all the time. So when our power goes out, which is regularly, my power has gone out every day for the last 6 days, sometimes for 3 to 4 hours, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 15 minutes. You'll have Virgin Islanders that have moved away and they'll be like, oh, this is why I had to leave. And they almost pick at an open wound that's already there. But then we'll also complain when they come back and it's like, "Oh, I don't even see my people anymore. The investors coming up and they're building up everything." But there's not that honoring, I think, that we should do more. Like there's grief on both sides of the displacement and the fact that it's very hard to live here. And I don't own a house because I cannot afford one as a young person who's worked all my life. I can't afford a house in the Virgin Islands right now. And like there's just a lot of ways in which we've experienced grief on both sides. And so I think one, the connection for the diaspora has to look like reconciliation with our own grief, whether that is the grief of leaving, the grief of staying, the grief of what that does to belonging when you have to leave and you have children. It's just like, well, are my children Virgin Islanders because they were born in Florida? Like, or are my grandchildren still Caribbean people? Even though we've been a few generations removed from the Caribbean. And so I also think that there's that, and then there's also an additional wounding of when you leave your Caribbean country, sometimes there's a way where people think that they're better than, and so they
Yes.
look down on the people that are remaining, and it's just like, "How come you don't want more for yourself? You don't wanna own that house? You don't want that better healthcare, that better education for your children?" Without acknowledging that, like, the work that people are doing who remain here is work that has to happen if we intend keeping the Caribbean region for Caribbean people. And so there's a particular labor and sacrifice that happens on both sides that has to be acknowledged. And the reason why I think that that's so important, because I know people will traditionally be like, oh, we just have to keep our cultural practices alive no matter where we go. And we have to remember to teach them to our children. I think all of that is super important. But I think that the most important part is we have to acknowledge the grief that we
Yes.
are all carrying for a bulk of reasons. And we have to talk about it. And we have to keep referencing the fact that a lot of us are feeling an immense amount of pain because we see this happening? And then when we talk about a pain and we can meet each other in the center of our own sorrow and acknowledge that all pain is valid, then we are at a place where we can build together because we can trust each other.
No, that's perfectly said because I do definitely believe that because I know with my research connecting into with other family members who, again, as you said, there are 3 or 4 generations removed from the
Mhm.
Caribbean living in the United States. and they know nothing of it and couldn't be able to tell. And there was, as you not necessarily agree, but there was a loss there as well because now
Yeah.
they don't have that connection. Like it's,
Yeah.
as you said, it's multifaceted in terms of what that loss and what that lack of connection will be able to do.
Mhm.
And then, for what do you feel, I guess, Gabrielle, is, your responsibilities to future generations too, as well, to continue with these stories? Like, how do you, I guess, wrap your head around that aspect of things?
Yeah, I think our future generations deserve for us to believe in them. So I try to reframe from commentary that's deeply absolute and
Mhm.
deeply cynical, where, sometimes people will be like, oh, it's too far gone. Nothing's going to change. And I can't commit to that. Like I just don't believe. And maybe I am a hopeful idiot, but I see a whole bunch of potential and possibility. And I think that we have to give each other the encouragement, and we have to build the courage within ourselves to dream and to be able to imagine a world in which we could stay in our homes and we can reap the benefit of being here and live comfortably and live with dignity. I also think that we kind of have to acknowledge that we're going to have to step outside of ourselves in order to be able to achieve the dream of a Caribbean community that works for Caribbean people. And that means doing a lot of therapy work, a lot of personal healing and reconciliation, and identifying how we continue to choose our own suffering and how we contribute to the suffering of other people. And I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. Because again, it just goes back down to there's work, there's acknowledgement to be done. And you mentioned something that as well that is probably uncomfortable for a lot of people who are probably in this space, but you have to almost walk in fear to do this because you're
Yeah.
walking most times alone. Nobody can see your vision at this point in time until much later, right? So it is definitely a lonely path, but as well you're doing it for the greater good, so to speak. So that's
Yeah.
yeah,
And when you dream, you unconsciously give other people permission to dream. So
absolutely.
it's just like when you start to really like talk about it over again. And so I see a lot of my work is like planting seeds, where it's
Yeah.
just like I spend a lot of my content not just talking about like political history and
Mhm.
like colonialism, but also talking about like the ripple effect of like social interaction and how we show up in the world. And right now, the Virgin Islands is plagued with this whole Jeffrey Epstein situation that's unfolding in the news. And I think it's brought up a lot of important questions. And today, the Virgin Islands is who's caught up with the Jeffrey Epstein thing because of our connection to the United States and whatever. But it could have been any other Caribbean island because the f- the circumstances are similar in
Mhm.
that we're a community that needs a lot, and everybody has their own desire to ensure that their family is okay.
Mhm.
And there's a way in which it just so happened to be us. But how many times are investors coming in and investing money and promising kickbacks and this, that, and the other? And you hear about our political elites kind of falling into it. And I think that there's bigger questions there
Mhm.
about what do we truly value. And I think it goes back to we have a vision problem where we are not courageous enough to dream and believe of that community that works for all of us. And so in the midst of being that, you know, in that feeling of like, I don't see it happening, you tend to start to make decisions of, okay, how can I protect myself and my family? How can I develop wealth while I'm in this political position to ensure that my children and my grandchildren may be able to hold on? And so I talk about it a little bit too from a compassionate point of view,
Mhm.
where it's just like I'm a little bit compassionate to the leaders who kind of fall into that. Not that they don't lack not that they absolutely don't lack integrity. They absolutely need to be held accountable across the board. But I have a friend who always says that when we learn to betray each other in intimate spaces, we
Mhm.
learn to betray each other at scale. And what she talks about is that until and unless we look within ourselves and our interpersonal connections, and we start to see how the same energy that we seed in the lives of each other is the same energy we feel from our political systems, we'll continue to be fighting a losing battle. There's so many stories of people stealing land from each other, from parents leveraging inheritance over their kids' heads through control. And so there's a way in which we do that to each other, and then we're confused on why does it feel like everybody in the politics is corrupt and they're doing all of these secret deals, and not being able to make the connection of these is our people, and our political infrastructure is a direct reflection of the consciousness of our community. So if we want change to occur, we have to raise our own consciousness.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. And then I know, Gabrielle, you said, during this discussion that you're a hopeful person. So what gives you hope about the future of these stories of the Caribbean?
Yeah. What gives me hope is that, I'm a lover of astrology, and I feel like a lot of the energies right now, and I feel it collectively too. So if you're not a stars and planets person, I could feel it deep within my being that there's, as Bob Marley says, there's a natural mystic flowing through the air. And there's a big change happening, and I think it exceeds the Caribbean community. I think it is a global change where people are starting to question systems that have been in place, that have been the status quo, but that now feel like they're crumbling beneath our feet. And I think that what happens is in the midst of collapse, it is deeply uncomfortable and it is painful. And a lot of people are going to lose a lot. And I'm not just talking about financially, but I also think that when those systems collapse and we are standing amongst the rubble, we are in a place that is 0 point. It is the place of infinite potential. We've been taught to believe that zero means nothing. You don't have nothing. It's void. But the zero is in fact the cosmic egg. It is where everything starts. It is where beginning of life. It is the aurora, like the Ouroboros. It is literally you are standing at the precipice of potential. And you're standing at the edge of that cliff waiting to take flight as a bird. And I believe with all of my heart that we are going to be given an immense gift of getting to start over and rebuilding these systems. And I believe that I see that happening even as consciousness around the world continues to stretch and people are really focused, especially regionally, on cultural preservation. I see a lot of commentary around our tourism product and people wanting to be like, we need to double down on storytelling. We need to start engaging with ethical travel and wellness travel and travel that is, maybe like work exchange, where people come and they spend money, but they also give back and there's volunteer work. And I think that our society is craving that. They're craving the feeling, they're craving the evocative nature of what I think storytelling brings. And so I think that storytelling has a great potential of changing hearts and uplifting spirits. And I believe that it'll be a very important vehicle as we move forward.
No, definitely, because it opens up the imagination for you to be
Yeah.
able to think and for you to see what could potentially be a possibility, right? So once that's opened up and once that's activated, what anybody could achieve is impossible or possible to be perceived type of thing. So what would you say, what can people do today? Not necessarily that they have to be in the Caribbean or the diaspora, but what can people do today?
I think people need to read books. We are in such a literacy crisis. I think people need to learn as much as they can. I think people need to engage with literature. People need to make art. When you see humanity slip into the depths of darkness, and I do think that we are headed there, if we are not already there, as an appendage of the United States, allegedly, I feel the weight of what's happening in the United States. And I think the United States is experiencing end stage empire collapse. And as a Caribbean community that is attached to the United States, I see a way in which the United States as a sinking ship will take its territories with it. And we will from there get to decide what we do with that chaos and collapse. But I think today we need to be learning as much as we can. So that way, when we get to a place where we are rebuilding a world with intentionality. And I think that people need to start learning about the things that they deem as like too boring. And I think people need to read about politics. They need to read about empire collapse. They need to read about civilization and how civilization is formed. Because I think that if we want a seat at the table of at the building, then we need to. History is such a wealth of information, and I love this saying that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we as a society have separated ourselves so much from historical understanding and research. Or there's been so much conspiracy theorying, like whitewashed, desanitized, or sanitized historical accounts that we don't really have a really great grasp on true historical documentation. I started listening to Howard Zinn's The People's United States,
Yeah.
and it was so, like, eye-opening and, you hear a lot, but he puts it into a way where it's easily digestible,
Mm-hmm.
just how far-reaching United States hegemony is. And a lot of the horrible things they've done on their own soil, let alone everybody else's at this point. And so I would say that what we have to do today is we have to learn as much as we can and separate ourselves from like the media and a lot of the news and the propaganda and really read read it all. Read as much as you can, even the things that make you uncomfortable, even the things that go against your belief systems, read it anyways, because we are about to experience a time where we can create a world that works for us. But if we don't have any of the historical context, we may end up recreating what we already have.
Exactly. No, absolutely. It's definitely reading is definitely a very powerful tool. Understand though that accessing a lot of these historical documents has become very limited. So
Yeah,
it's almost like it's almost turning to be exclusive to a certain
yeah,
degree. And I know it's definitely harder in the Caribbean region when, you have to make an appointment to go and access and look at which something that should be freely accessible, right? Or
absolutely.
there's not enough space, whatever, or you have to pay. Not everybody is going to be in a position to be able to pay a fee to look at documents that they should not have to pay and should be able to freely be able to have access to. So
For sure.
there are challenges, but there are ways around it as well. But I agree
Mhm.
with what you're saying. And then, as we come to a close, Gabrielle, how do we move from just listening to action? I know you probably mentioned this in a couple of different ways, but would you say as, I guess, as a stronghold, really, that we move from just a listening phase to now we are
Mhm.
actually putting that into action?
I would say that, something that my friend also says, her name is Hadia Suer, she's brilliant, but she always says that when we are talking about revolution, everybody has their own role in the revolution. It serves a revolution not to have everybody on the front lines.
Mhm.
Some people need to be like medical staff, some people need to be, you know, preparing the food, some people need to be cleaning workspaces. There's a way in which everybody's role helps to make the machine of resistance move forward. And so I would say that what people need to do is people need to start figuring out, where is my role in the revolution? What am, what are my skill set? What is my skill set? What does my time look like? What does my money look like? Where can I pour resources into the movements that mean a lot to me? And so, like I wanted to write more uplifting news articles, so I became a journalist. So I write for a local newspaper part-time, and I specifically highlight the events, the nonprofits, the free children and elder opportunities, because that's important to me. And so I think that there's a way where everybody needs to do the work of figuring it out. Where do are you a really great speaker? Are you someone that can go and teach everyday skills like planting or fishing to the children in the public schools? Are you somebody that is more ecologically centered, and maybe you want to go and plant mangroves because our coastlines are being eroded by the continuous storms coming through? Where can you be of service? But you must be of service. Everyone must be of service.
Exactly. Well said. Thank you so much. And again, Gabrielle, I really do appreciate you have come on and spent your time speaking your truth on the podcast today. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor. And I just want to say I acknowledge the hardship in finding historical information about the Caribbean and the access issues. On Instagram, Know Your Caribbean, I think the young lady who runs it is Fiona.
Yeah.
Her page is the most comprehensive Caribbean history page that I have encountered, and her work is brilliant.
Yeah.
And so thank you for raising the access point. And I encourage people to find avenues in which they can access, like your podcast.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Of course.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.